You're listening to History and Horseplay on Mr. Little's History Bites. Our story begins with a Tibetan government and exile representative meeting with a group of supporters in the United States in Utah. This man named T.T. Karma Chopel was there to talk about the possible evolution of Tibetan democracy. But according to the story, he kept getting repeatedly distracted. What was he distracted by? He was distracted by the mountains. The snowy, white-capped mountains. He kept thinking about the mountains in the Himalayas. And he couldn't help but ask, where are your nomads? He was no doubt thinking about the yak herders and the horsemen that moved all around Tibet over the course of the year. And he asked the Americans who he was meeting with, where are your nomads? Who are they? Now, of course, this question of nomads in the Americas for most Americans brings to mind the image of the Plains Indian, perhaps riding a horse or hunting buffalo with a feathered headdress. And while this is true, and this is the most common picture in our minds, nomadism, the role of nomads in world history, is much more extensive and much more complex. And that's what I'd like to talk to you about today. Examining the roles that nomads play in world history tells us a lot about our interactions between different cultural groups and different lifestyles, and gives us a new way to look at the past and possibly even the future. Let's start with an overview of what nomads and nomadism is. To do that, we must go back around 8,000 years BC, about 10,000 years ago. Up to this point, humans were what we would call hunter-gatherers. And this conjures up images of humans in animal skin cloth, traveling in small bands together, hunting big game like woolly mammoths. And while that's mostly true, this also includes a lot of fishing. These groups were indeed rather small, maybe 10 to 20 people, and they were closely related. They were connected via family ties. Anthropologists call this term kinship ties. We today might more colloquially call it a clan. Now, we got to get some definitions down, because while hunter-gatherers were the most common form of human existence for almost all of human history, there are some conflations between hunter-gatherers and nomads. Many history textbooks conflate hunter-gatherers and nomads, and while it's important to understand that some hunter-gatherers were nomads, nomads are not by default hunter-gatherers. So let's go ahead and get some definitions here. Now, while there's disagreement, as there is with everything, amongst those who do research, the definitions I'm working with today come from two sources. They come from Webster's Dictionary, and they come from the work of Anatoly Kazanov, a Soviet-born researcher of nomadic cultures and nomadic lifestyles. So we'll start with hunting and gathering. So a hunter-gatherer, a group of hunter-gatherers, are a group of individuals who follow a lifestyle in which gathering for food via foraging, fishing, and hunting is the primary form of subsistence and is the primary activity in which all are concerned. Hunter-gatherer societies don't tend to have large, settled communities. They don't tend to have large, complex expressions of art. They don't tend to have complex religious organizations. The primary occupation of all is finding food to survive. Compare this with the definition of a nomad. According to Webster's Dictionary, a nomad is one person or a group of people which move around without fixed habitation. Now again, this sounds like they're the same thing, but there is a critical distinction between a nomad and a hunter-gatherer. And we have to dig a little deeper into something called nomadic pastoralism, which is we start to get into the work of Anatoly Kazanov. So nomadic pastoralism is defined as a form of nomadism where groups of people who move with herds of animals, such as cows, horses, camels, sheep, goats, yaks, water buffalo, lambs, and any large mammal that's easily domesticatable and can move about with a group of people. These listed animals that I've just described in part explain why nomadism until the 17th century was purely a product of Afro-Eurasia and not the Americas. Those animals did not exist in the Americas. Now, this is what separates nomadic pastoralism, or nomads, as we're just going to go ahead and call it from this point forward. This what separates nomads from hunter-gatherers is that hunter-gatherers do not have animal herds that they travel with. Now, where there's a little bit of overlap between nomads and hunter-gatherers is that Some groups of nomads practice transhumanance. Hunter-gatherers also practice a degree of transhumanance. Transhumanance is a fixed movement or route. So, for example, hunter-gatherers might stay within a fixed zone or a fixed area at certain times of the year and then move to a different fixed area at a different time of the year. In the same way that nomads sometimes bring their herds to one location for summer grazing and move them to another location for winter grazing. This is what's called transhumanance. Now, transhumanance, again, reminds us that while some hunter-gatherers were nomads, not nomads by default are not hunter-gatherers. And so I just want to make sure we got that. So let's go back and talk a little bit about hunter-gatherers, and we're going to quickly walk through the agricultural revolution. So pre-agricultural revolution, or Neolithic revolution as it is sometimes referred to, life was very different. There were no cities, there were no buildings. Religious life was more connected with the earth, less formal deities, and lacking a priestly class. Most people, if they needed spiritual guidance, they consulted a shaman who would connect them with the earth. Society was more communal, and there was no sense of what we might call private property, or there was a very undeveloped form of private property. With the rise of the agricultural revolution, that is the rise of humans planting and staying and taking care of that plant, and then harvesting the plant and using that as sustenance versus moving around, this led to a massive change in society. With humans now sedentary, we begin to see a sense of private property. These are my plants, not your plants. We begin to see the rise of social classes. Someone who does the planting, someone who does the ruling, someone who organizes the collection of the planting. And we begin to see the rise of complex religious organizations. There is a priestly class who prays to the gods. Which gods? Why, the gods of the rain. And now the god of the rain has a name and maybe even a picture, because you have a class of artists whose sole job it is to create artistic works. All of these major changes come with the agricultural revolution. Of course, this always leads to another big question of why was there an agricultural revolution in the first place? If hunter-gatherers had been the predominant form of human life, actually the only form of life as far as we've ever known, why give it up? Why abandon it? And while that question has been taken up by many scholars and scientists and archaeologists and anthropologists and has a number of answers and is still hotly debated, we do know a couple of things about why humans made this shift. One was that it really did happen over time. It's called the agricultural revolution, and when we say revolution, we might be thinking of something that happens over the course of a few years, but this revolution no doubt took several generations, nay millennia, perhaps, to be finally perfected. And even once the agricultural revolution was quote-unquote complete, and there were whole societies dedicated to farming, agriculture would not take over, so to speak, the planet for another several thousand years. The other thing that we know about the agricultural revolution is that it was probably not something humans did by choice. Again, a lot of theories, a lot of debate, but it is one of the more popular theories is that there was a shift in the global climate, forcing several hunting and gathering groups to begin to cultivate wild grains. And maybe they had been doing this a little bit before, but the shift in the climate reduced the availability of game and other foods they had traditionally relied on and forced them to turn to these grains that now make up the bulk of our diet even to this day. Now, it's important to talk about the agricultural revolution because historically it has been thought that nomadism was a sort of in-between. We went from hunter-gatherers to nomads to agriculturalists. And this has informed the thought of many Western thinkers, and this has informed the attitudes that individuals had from, say, Europe or America. But what's important to keep in mind is that nomadism relies on domesticated animals that can be easily herded and moved about, and specifically the horse and the camel. It was the domestication of these animals that made nomadism possible in the first place. Professor Andrew Sherrod in 1981 wrote about something called the secondary products revolution. And while this is only one of several theories, it's the most popular one as of now. And the secondary products revolution basically describes the case where humans domesticated animals around the same time that the agricultural revolution happened. But over time, humans began to realize, about 2,000 years into the agricultural revolution, humans began to realize that they could get more out of domesticated animals than just flesh and blood. They could use them for more than just meat, right? They could get milk and by extension they could get cheese and butter, and if they slaughtered them they could also use their furs as skins. And they could also use them for transportation. And they could also use animals to pull agricultural tools such as plows or to spread seeds. So in this secondary products revolution, animals became a much larger part of our lives, and it's this secondary products revolution that allowed nomadism to exist. Nomads rely on their animals not just for meat, but for everything. Milk, cheese, sustenance. They use them as products to be traded with settled people for things they might be lacking. In particular, we must give credit to the horse above all others, the domestication of the horse. An easy-to-ride, comparatively strong, very reliable animal was domesticated in Central Asia, and if I might note in an aside that both Russia and Ukraine and Kazakhstan all claim that it was in their contemporary territory that the horse was domesticated. I think Ukraine even has a statue claiming that this is exactly where the horse was domesticated, although there's no evidence that any of these three locations potentially are the location for the domestication of the horse. But it's appropriate that the horse was domesticated in Central Asia because it's in Central Asia, the long chain of steppes and deserts that extend from China in the east to Russia in the west, where the horse nomads would continue to dominate much of world history up until only about the last 600 years. But even, I think, more fascinating is the implication of understanding this, that nomadism is in fact not a stop on the way to settled agricultural life that we're also used to. Nomadism is an alternative. Nomadism is a different way of doing things. Although it probably did not happen this way, it's fun to think that somebody said one day, they put down their plow and said, you know what, I don't really want to farm anymore. This life is kind of terrible. I'd rather exist outside of farming. I'm going to take my animals and go into the wild. It's fun to think that, and that's probably not how it happened. But nonetheless, the fact that nomadism is not some sort of inferior form of existence, but rather is in fact an alternative form of existence, really forces us to rethink our linear nature of history. Now, it's true that nomads tended to predominate in areas where farming was marginal at best, meaning that you couldn't actually grow a lot of food. Nonetheless, they represent agency in human history, the power of humans to choose their own destiny. Probably the most famous example were the Comanche Indians of the American Plains. The group that would become the Comanche moved into the Great Plains, that is the states of Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, Oklahoma, and some of modern-day Mexico. And initially they were marginal farmers. They farmed a little bit on the edges of the most arable land. And they hunted buffalo, but not terribly effectively because they did not have access to some sort of animal to help them hunt, like a horse. Then after the 1600s, with the arrival of the Spanish and the introduction of the horse, the Comanche adopted the horse and completely gave up farming in any way, shape, or form. It would not be an overstatement to say that the horse literally transformed them from their previous cultural identity into the Comanche, who then became not only true nomads of the American plains, moving around their horse herds and hunting buffalo, but also some of the fiercest warriors of the American plains, forming their own empire that we refer to as Comancheria. This is simply the most well-known example of the nomadic process. This also occurred in sub-Saharan Africa, as well as parts of North Africa within the Sahara Desert. The difference there being the camel instead of the horse was the decisive factor. So, about 2,000 years ago, where would we find nomads in the world? Well, as I said before, it's important to understand that nomadism can only exist in marginal areas where farming and settled agriculture without modern technology would not be possible. And so, for example, you might find nomads in the steppes of Central Asia, the Sahel, which is a region just south of the Sahara, which is very difficult to farm in, the Arabian Peninsula, as well as parts of southern Africa. Again, the Great Plains of what is now the United States, as well as the Pampas of Argentina, would also be ideal locations for nomads. The problem was, at this time, 2,000 years ago, there were no horses or other comparable animals in those regions, and therefore they did not have nomads in them at the time. And it's important to understand what I mean by marginal. Marginal means that there were still settled agriculturalists in these areas, but they were nowhere near as many as, say, the heavily agricultural population centers of great empires like Rome or the capitals of China or the various Indian kingdoms. And that's important to understand because it means that nomads and settled agriculturalists did live side by side. And their relationship, and how these two groups got along with one another, forces us to consider how we look at history, their historical perspectives, and access to historical sources between different groups of people. So the relationship between nomads and settled peoples serves to remind us about the limits of history as a science. This is in part because when we look back at information about nomads and settled peoples, we have so very little information about the nomads and the nomad side of the story. This is in part because nomads don't tend to have social classes and complex political structures. Therefore, there are fewer documents from which the nomads could have written down their thoughts, their ideas, or their points of view. Those that did survive are usually incomplete or are difficult to decipher or even attribute to. Which nomadic group do you attribute this document to? Nomads traditionally passed on their histories via oral tradition, that is, without the written word. Unfortunately, that can be a very quick way to lose a lot of history. One very untimely death can undo centuries of tradition. But from what we do know, looking at the point of view of the settled people, the relationship between nomads and settled agriculturalists has been somewhat of a mixed bag. Some of the earliest references we have about nomads come from holy texts. For example, in the Christian Old Testament and the Jewish Torah, the book of Genesis refers to the relationship between nomads and the state of Egypt. It is said that the Egyptians despise nomads. This could be in reference to the invasion of Egypt by nomadic peoples. In the book of Jeremiah, also found in the Jewish Torah and the Old Testament, nomads are described as a divine punishment. When God describes the faithlessness of the Jewish people, he describes them as nomads in the desert. But of course, those who read the Bible will also note that the imagery of the shepherd, that is, of someone watching their flock, is often repeated throughout the Bible, and oftentimes in a positive light. God and Jesus are often referred to as shepherds watching their sheep, shepherds protecting their flock, shepherds being sources of wisdom and judgment, at least as far as the Bible and the Torah are concerned. Another interesting example comes from ancient China. In ancient China, you had these things called oracle bones. Oracle bones were these animal bones, and you'd throw them into the fire, and gradually the heat would crack the bone. Then you would have priests and scholars look at the bone and attempt to interpret what the cracks mean, and then write down the interpretation on the bone. These are some of the best sources we have for ancient China. What we know is that in a lot of these bones, there were descriptions of nomadic peoples as possibly a punishment from heaven, or somebody's angry ancestor was sending the nomads after the settled Chinese people. So nomads, at least in the Chinese context, were looked at pretty unfavorably by the settled peoples of China. Attila the Hun, who was a famous leader who led a group of nomads called the Huns, from the steppes of what is now Ukraine over into modern-day Hungary, and raided and pillaged the crumbling Roman Empire, even getting so close as to almost sack Rome himself, was referred to as was a terror in the eyes of Christendom. He was often referred to as the scourge of God, sent to punish the Christians for their sinful ways. This same idea was appropriated by the Russians when they were describing the Mongols raiding them and ruling them in the Middle Ages. However, if we transition south a little bit, in pre-Islamic Arabia, the image of nomads is actually much more positive. The nomads of the desert, who conducted trade between the settled states and empires of the north and the small kingdoms of the south and what's now Yemen and parts of modern-day Ethiopia and Somalia, these nomads who rode camels and conducted business were viewed as hardier and tougher than city-dwelling people, more in tune with nature and the world. The Prophet Muhammad, who would go on to found the religion of Islam, spent much of his childhood with nomads, traveling with their caravans. This was a decision made by his uncle to help make sure that the boy was tough and understood the ways of the world, and may explain why the Prophet himself became a merchant. And this serves as a reminder that nomads played a valuable role in their relationships with settled societies, and that is facilitating long-distance communication and exchange. Nomads often had a better knowledge of the terrain and a better ability to navigate that terrain because they spend their entire lives moving around these areas. Therefore, when you need to move goods between two locations with unfavorable terrain in between, you might hire a nomad to do that. Across Eurasia, nomads were famed for their trading prowess. A 13th century Italian text advising merchants in the Crimean region stated that if you wanted to go east, a Tatar nomad would be the best guide. This is also true of exchanging ideas as well. It is through nomads that ideas and technologies such as the horse itself, things like the wheel, or religions like Christianity and Islam were spread further than they previously might have been able to spread, in part because nomads can cover much greater distances. So when discussing the relationship between settled people and nomads, it is indeed a mixed record. Traditional accounts of nomads as ardent enemies of settled, civilized society and divine punishments contrast with records of their value as merchants and spreaders of ideas, as well as the perception of their connection to the natural world. This mixed bag reminds us that when we look at ancient sources, we have to be careful about whose point of view they may be coming from and what story they might be telling, since it seems with nomads there are two sides of the coin. Sometimes, though, nomads did take charge, and while most of our sources come from settled agricultural societies, there were times when nomads did take charge of those settled agricultural societies. So, when talking about nomadic ideas of kingship and rulership, it's important to understand that nomadic groups didn't tend to trend towards large political organizations. Much like their hunter-gatherer predecessors, nomads tended to be relatively small groups that were linked together in clans and families. The kinship ties, that is the immediate family connections, make it a bit harder to develop a broader, wider empire based on family ties. Just think of how well you get along with your siblings and see if you could run an empire with them. One of the first things to understand then about nomadic states is that they tend to be confederacies, that is made up of multiple nomadic groups brought together under a common leader or sometimes against a common enemy. In the years before 1400, that is 600 years ago, but even as late as only 200 years ago, there were nomadic states as well as states made up of predominantly nomads across the world. One of the earliest we know of is the nomadic state of the Xiongnu Confederation, which spent much of its history threatening China during the Han Dynasty about 2,000 years ago. The Xiongnu Confederation formed under a series of charismatic leaders, but upon the death of some of those charismatic leaders, as well as upon several military defeats by the Han Dynasty, the Confederacy gradually dissolved into a number of smaller groups that spread out and went different directions. Because they lack many of the traditional political institutions, such as bureaucrats, record keepers, and civil servants, nomadic states are inherently somewhat unstable. Succession struggles can often become an issue and sometimes could bring about the end of a nomadic state. While every nomadic state differed, there was usually some degree of democracy when it came to choosing a leader, and leaders would need to demonstrate their ability to lead via their military prowess, their skills in battle, and while this can make for strong rulers, it can also make for a very unclear line of succession when a ruler dies. A ruler's son is not by default given control of the nomadic confederacy. The death of a charismatic leader can lead to the end of a nomadic confederacy as quickly as it was formed under said charismatic leader. Attila the Hun would be a great example of this. Upon Attila's death, his empire very quickly petered out. When they ruled over non-nomadic peoples, nomads tried to set themselves apart as superior and build social hierarchies with them on the top. To reinforce their distinction from the settled agricultural peoples that they ruled over, nomads tended to continue nomadic traditions such as horse riding, that of the royal hunt, and dressing as though they still lived in their nomadic lifestyles even if they technically lived in a palace. This can be seen throughout history. So for example, the Mongol rulers of China oftentimes sponsored massive month-long royal hunts to continue to demonstrate their hunting prowess. The early rulers of the first Islamic states, the caliphates, they tended to build their great palaces and fortresses out in the desert as a reminder of their connection to the nomadic desert lifestyle. And probably the most expensive example of all of this could be the sultans of Delhi, who were originally Turkic nomads from Central Asia, but who took over parts of northern India. Horses that they were very fond of were not native to India and had a hard time existing in the climate of northern India. So the Delhi sultans were constantly paying very high prices to import horses and import horse breeders from Central Asia to bring their horses down into India so that they could continue to be the nomadic rulers over these settled agricultural peoples. But how were nomads able to conquer such large settled agricultural societies in the first place? Well, it's important to understand that nomads have always been viewed with great admiration, as I mentioned before, but also great terror by the settled populations of Eurasia. Nomads, and particularly their skill with a horse or a camel and a bow and arrow, made them easily superior to slower, non-mounted peasant armies, or even trained knights, of which there were not so many of. The central role of hunting in nomadic life, even if it did not make up a large part of their diet, did nonetheless give them a great prowess on mounted horse as well as with a bow and arrow. And back in a pre-gunpowder world, a bow and arrow was essentially the secret weapon that allowed you to dominate the field of battle. One could ride around on their horse and shoot arrows at the hapless, unmounted enemies until they fled or were cut down. A great example of this would be something called the Parthian shot. This was a tactic employed by the Parthians who ruled over what is now Iran and parts of the Middle East in the time of the Roman Empire. The Romans were defeated on two very notable occasions by the Parthians because they practiced this tactic known as the Parthian shot. And what they would do is they would feign a retreat. They would pretend to start running away. And when the enemy, the Romans, let their guard down and let their shields down, the Parthians would turn around in their horses and shoot a rapid volley of arrows at the Romans and simply devastate their ranks. It was their skills in military prowess as well as their abilities with horses or camels that made nomads so devastatingly powerful. Of course, every nomad leader has a great story. For example, Genghis Khan famously practiced psychological warfare to defeat his enemies. But regardless, it was their military prowess that allowed them to conquer so many of the settled peoples, a trend that peaked around the year 1400 but would not be fully extinguished until the advent of modern machine guns in the late 1800s. Well, you might be under the impression that nomads, as individuals that don't have a long history of established political institutions, running a complex agricultural society might be a disaster, and there were some notable cases historically of mismanagement by former nomads. Nomads also brought to their states features of life that in the 21st century we might look fondly upon. Number one would simply be that because nomads did not come to their conquered states with complex religious ideas or institutions, they did not expect people to embrace their form of religion. As stated before, the predecessors to nomads, hunter-gatherers, were often much more connected with the earth, and if they needed religious guidance, they consulted a shaman. In the case of the Mongols and most of the other Central Asian nomads, there was one god, there was Tengri, or the sky god. And this is still popular among nomads, even in Central Asia today. But Tengri was not a jealous god per se, and the Mongol rulers in particular, for example, did not demand that everybody accept Tengri. They only demanded that people acknowledge Mongol political authority, which by extension came from Tengri. For this reason, though, the Mongols did not demand everybody convert, and therefore throughout the Mongol realm you could find any number of religions. This can probably be summed up most famously by Mang Khan, the eldest son of Genghis Khan, who, when asked by a Christian priest about converting, said something to the effect of, "Just as God has given man several fingers, he has given mankind several paths," paths referring to religions. That quote really sums up the nomadic view towards religion. Now, it's true that some notable groups of nomads, such as the Amazigh in the Sahara Desert, sometimes known as Berbers, as well as the Turkic peoples of Central Asia, did convert to Islam, and some branches of the Mongol Empire and Mongols did convert to Buddhism. By and large, these nomads did not force their religion on anybody. And nomadic societies, like their hunter-gatherer predecessors, were much more egalitarian by the standards of their time. In both societies, hunter-gatherers and nomads, the survival of the group depended on the role of all people. Men might go hunt, and hunting was a big deal, but the animal products created by the herds and nomadic groups such as cheese, and for hunter-gatherer groups, the non-hunted materials such as roots and berries and grains, roles were predominantly occupied by women. And these formed a much larger part of the diets of both societies. As mentioned before, because they lacked complex religious hierarchies and complex religious classes, nomads also lacked some of the religious justifications for the reinforcement of what we would consider traditional gender norms. Combine the balance of work as well as the lack of traditional gender norms, and you have societies where some of the most fierce leaders in history are, in fact, women. One of the earliest accounts of a female nomadic leader comes from the Greek historian Herodotus. It tells us about a female nomadic warrior named Tomyris, who leads a group of nomads known as the Scythians against the Persian Empire, and kills the founder of the Persian Empire, Cyrus, in battle, maybe even personally beheading him, or maybe having someone else behead him for her. It's not totally clear. Jack Weatherford, the historian, tells the story of how Genghis Khan's granddaughters played a major role in preserving his legacy in the Mongol realm. Right up into the age of the Mongols, where the historian Jack Weatherford, in his book Mongol Queens, recounts the tale of Genghis Khan's granddaughters, who helped keep the Mongol traditions alive even after the fall of the Mongol dynasties in China, as well as in Persia. Even before the nomads themselves were rulers, they were often admired for their military prowess and military ability. Oftentimes, nomads were either captured and enslaved as children, or sometimes recruited to serve as soldiers by rulers who felt they could not trust their own soldiers. This happened throughout history in a number of locations, but perhaps the most famous one were the Muslim rulers in the Middle Ages who hired Turkic soldiers to serve as their personal bodyguards, known as Mamluks. Now, the Mamluks were not just nomads. They could be from other parts of the world too, most notably the Caucasus, which were not predominantly nomadic. The Mamluks were trained as soldiers. They had everything supplied for them and oftentimes were very politically powerful and connected. And so it stands to reason that eventually some of these Mamluks decide that they would in fact do a better job of running the show than their Arab or Persian masters might. This gave rise to a number of Mamluk dynasties across the Islamic world, the most famous of which was in Egypt, which lasted until the 1500s. This Mamluk dynasty in Egypt is also quite famous for defeating the Mongol incursion into the Middle East. Mamluks versus Mongols, nomads versus nomads. In the end, the Mamluks defeated the Mongols and forced them to retreat, preventing a further Mongol invasion of North Africa. The phenomenon of nomads invading and conquering states was most keenly felt perhaps in the Islamic world, and this is reflected in the work of one of the great scholars of the Middle Ages from the Islamic world known as Ibn Khaldun. Now, Ibn Khaldun was a very brilliant man, and he wrote many theories on many topics, but in particular, he wrote a theory of history in which nomads played a central role. In his book, The Muqaddimah, Ibn Khaldun describes an idea he refers to as asabiya, or unity. That is the cohesion within a certain social group, and Ibn Khaldun believed that this unity, this asabiya, was strongest within nomads. And because this unity was so strong within nomadic groups, this enhanced their military prowess. Ibn Khaldun's great theory of history sort of went like this. Nomads, because of their great unity and hardy nature, would set out and conquer a weak, established dynasty. However, over the generations, as these rulers forgot their nomadic ways, they gradually became more decadent, and the asabiya sort of gave way and gradually disappeared, until eventually, several generations later, a new group of nomads came in, toppled the old dynasty, and the process began over and over again. Now, of course, this idea is reflective of the old Islamic idea about nomads being hardier and more connected to the real spirituality of the desert. Even though this idea predates Islam, it nonetheless has flowed nicely into Islam. It also represents this idea that nomads represent sort of a real way of existing, whereas people in cities are soft and decadent. However, on the other hand, the fact that nomads' central role in history is to topple old regimes also seems to speak to the understanding that nomads were either inherently violent or at least capable of great violence. Again, an idea that was not unique to the Islamic world. Although Ibn Khaldun could not have known it, his descriptions of nomads applied in many other places outside of the Middle East, including some parts of Europe as well as some periods in Chinese history. In fact, throughout Chinese history, there is a term Chinese historians use called nomadic dynasties. That is, either dynasties, such as the Yuan and the Qing, or smaller kingdoms during periods of disunity, which were created and ruled predominantly by nomads or former nomads. The high point of nomadic political power across Eurasia no doubt came in the years leading up to the Mongol conquest. Across Eurasia, a number of nomadic dynasties established themselves in places such as Egypt, most of the Middle East, parts of northern India, peaking but not ending with the Mongols in the 1200s. They would be followed up by one last major nomadic conqueror named Tamerlane, who would attempt to rebuild a sort of Mongol empire with his vicious, lightning-fast attacks and grand psychological warfare. While the age of the nomad has receded, and nomads no longer hold sway over any state in the world today, it is still estimated that perhaps 50 million people around the world as of the year 2000 still practiced a nomadic lifestyle. One final thing to consider is that examining the roles of nomads historically, the perception of them and the roles that they actually played, might ask us to reconsider how we would look at the future. In particular, the case of the post-Soviet Republic of Kyrgyzstan provides an interesting example. Kyrgyzstan had been a small Soviet republic for the history of the Soviet Union. Prior to the establishment of the Soviet Union, it had been home to numerous nomadic groups. Under the Soviet Union, it developed an agricultural sector, and many of its people had settled down into cities. However, with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the ensuing chaos, the collapse of the central authority led to a revival of nomadism, where people began to return to practicing somewhat nomadic ways of life. Not pure pastoral nomadism, a sort of transhumance, but nonetheless, Kyrgyzstan reminds us that nomadism is not over, and that nomadism is a choice to be practiced, an act of agency, historically speaking, in a way to reject the predominantly agriculturalist world we still live in. Nomadism, by nature of the fact that it demonstrates history does not run on a linear path, can remind us that our future also does not run on a linear path. In the future, humans are hoping to explore space and the cosmos, distant planets and distant galaxies. Considering the massive undertaking and the massive cost that this might incur to set up, say, farming or industrial societies on other planets, might some young, enterprising, and ambitious individuals seek to become space nomads, herding groups of space cows across the cosmos or space horses across the cosmos? What that might look like, I don't know, but it is fun to think about. I want to thank you for joining me for this History Bite. I hope you've learned something, but I also hope you walk away with some questions. This is Mr. Little, and I'll see you next time.